So we have a full program to open this building and thank all the amazing donors. And we're going to do that right after the secretary speaks, because we really want to be able to have you all hear her remarks. And she has a very tight timeline to squeeze this in. So without any more ado, I'm going to introduce our amazing Senator Brown, who is standing, I think, right over here. All right, he's moved right over here, who you all know is a huge friend of manufacturing. He's a huge friend of ours and to our backbone, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership. So thank you for coming and everything you do. Over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. Madam Secretary, wonderful to have you back in Cleveland. I'll tell a real quick story. The first time that soon after Janet Yellen had become the chair of the Federal Reserve, she went through my committee. And so I asked her for one thing. I asked her to come to Cleveland. And she did her first visit outside of Washington after she was confirmed as Fed chair a decade or so ago. And she went to Alcoa, and her staff said to me, "Now, Senator, she's only here for 30 minutes. You understand that?" I said, "Yeah, I understand that." So an hour and a half later, and true, she put a hard hat on. An hour and a half later, she was sitting in a place at Alcoa in a booth, and she was operating the stamp for the 55-ton press stamped helicopter blades. And so it was pretty cool. So anyway, but my job with her really was to implant in her mind the importance of manufacturing to the industrial Midwest, but to a much larger than that, and what it meant to the country. And she has done that and then some over the years as the first female chair of the Federal Reserve, and then her wonderful work with this president as Secretary of the Treasury. Ethan, thank you wherever you were. Where'd Ethan go? Okay. All right. I couldn't find each other. All right. And thank you. This is a great tour, and I love it where you're located. I love it that this was a grade school. I love it what this symbolizes. I love it that Ethan talked about the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mostly Cleveland public school kids, but other public school kids too, that they will come through here and they will get to operate equipment and machinery, and they will understand there are all kinds of roads to the middle class. There is going to college, there is going to Tri-C, there is a union apprentice electrician or pipe fitter or laborers apprenticeship program. There's coming out of Cleveland public schools. There's coming out of trade school. There's coming out of all kinds of opportunities. And for the first time, finally, we have a government. We have a president that's on the side of manufacturing. We have a president finally that's passing an industrial policy. That's what the CHIPS Act was about. That's what Buy America in the infrastructure bill was about. That's what the Inflation Reduction Act was about, to finally put America on the course of reindustrializing our country, and how important that is. So it started with me. I grew up in Mansfield. Some of you know that maybe. I went to Johnny Appleseed Junior High School. That was the name of the school. And I remember this, walking the halls in Johnny Appleseed decades ago with sons and daughters of electricians that worked at Westinghouse, machinists that worked at Mansfield Tire. Machinists that worked at Ohio Brass, rubber workers that worked at Mansfield Tire, auto workers that worked in General Motors, the sons and daughters of electricians and pipe fitters and sheet metal workers and millwrights and carpenters, all making middle class wages, beginning finally to see a little more diversity and giving Black kids a path to the middle class too. And by the time I got to high school, by the time I went off to college, by the time in the next couple of decades, you saw those jobs. First, they went south to Arkansas and Mississippi as employers were looking for cheaper labor. That wasn't good enough. Then it was lobbying to push NAFTA and PNTR with China and these trade agreements through that essentially outsourced our manufacturing. That's what really had. But now we passed the CHIPS Act, including 2.2 billion for the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, which Ethan understands will play a really, really big big deal role here. You understood sooner than most, magnets understood sooner than most, the importance of keeping the next generation of manufacturing here in Cleveland, the importance of figuring out the needs of the workforce would be in this new era of modern manufacturing. So many students are interested now. When young people hear the word manufacturing, they may have used the term Rust Belt. As you know, President Biden in his State of the Union address, and then when he was at Intel in Columbus, said we're finally burying the term Rust Belt with the high tech manufacturing and investments in Ohio. It's Intel, it's Honda, it's solar manufacturing in Northwest Ohio. It's what we're doing here in Cleveland. Students and businesses represent the first step in bringing the supply chain back home. We know the biggest cause for inflation has been the spread out of the world of the supply chain, that we simply have not been able to get parts. Many of you run your own companies, many of you work in manufacturing. You've had those challenges to get the kind of parts you need, and the spreading out of the supply chain is the price we're paying for this. So that's yesterday, and tomorrow with Magnet, we know it's going to be something very different. When you love this country, you fight for the people who make it work. That's what Janet Yellen has done. Her time on the Fed, then her time as chair of the Fed. It's what she's doing as Treasury Secretary. She understands the dignity of a hard day's work, whether you punch a clock or swipe a badge, whether you work for tips, whether you're on salary, whether you own your own company. The dignity of work is what has built this country and will continue to build the country in the years ahead. My friend Janet Yellen.
Sure. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for introducing me to manufacturing here in Cleveland. And thank you for everything you've done to revive manufacturing in America and in Ohio. Thanks to Ethan and his team for hosting me here today. Thank you for letting me take part in the opening of your new center. The work you're doing shows how we can build on our strong manufacturing roots to create a brighter future in America. With this new space, Magnet's helping to incubate the next generation of innovators. It's also exposing thousands of students to the good paying manufacturing jobs that our economy is creating. I'm glad to be in Ohio. And I think it's a fitting place to discuss our administration's efforts to strengthen the American economy and the manufacturing sector. Ohio is the birthplace of new American industries. It's home to the Wright brothers, who invented the first airplane, and Charles Kettering, the Dayton resident who created the world's first automobile electric ignition. Even Thomas Edison was born just an hour from here. During my 2 years as Treasury Secretary, I have been laser focused on two economic priorities. First, rescuing the economy from the depths of the pandemic and stabilizing it amid additional global economic shocks. And second, strengthening the foundations of our post-pandemic economy. Our economic plan, powered by three major laws enacted over the past year, constitutes among the most significant investments we have ever made in the long-term strength of our economy. Today, I'll focus my remarks on President Biden's economic plan and how it will create resilient growth and an economy that works for all Americans. I'll talk specifically about the core role of American manufacturing in our agenda. Over the past 2 years, our administration has made significant investments in our country's industrial strength. These investments will create good paying jobs, make our economy more productive, more resilient, and ensure that economic opportunity is shared broadly beyond our country's coasts. But first, let me speak about the state of the economy when we took office and the progress that we've made. At the time of the president's inauguration in January 2021, the United States was in the depths of the pandemic. The virus was claiming more American lives a week than it had at any other point since the onset of the crisis. The economic calamity was also massive. Over 800,000 new jobless claims were being filed in an average week. Given the severity of the economic downturn, our administration took action to support households, businesses, and state and local governments through a once in a century health emergency. 2 years later, we've experienced one of the quickest economic recoveries in modern history. Since President Biden took office, we have created over 10 million jobs. Manufacturing jobs are growing at their fastest pace since the 1980s. Nearly 700,000 manufacturing jobs have been added since early last year, and we've seen significant investments in American manufacturing, including right here in Ohio. While these are promising signs, we still face challenges. Today, our economy faces high inflation and significant global headwinds. Now, Americans are rightly concerned that rising prices are eroding their living standards. So, our administration's top economic priority is to bring inflation down. But even in the face of these challenges, our economy remains resilient, bolstered by President Biden's economic plan. That resilience is evidenced by today's GDP report, which shows solid real GDP growth in our economy in the third quarter. We're seeing ample signs of America's economic strength despite global challenges like the impact of Putin's illegal war and successive waves of COVID. Our unemployment rate is at its lowest point in over 50 years. Household balance sheets remain strong. And these signals are consistent with an economy that is shifting from an historically fast recovery to sustainable growth. As our administration continues to tackle our immediate challenges, we've also been focused on strengthening the long term foundations of the American economy. So let me now turn to the three pillars of our economic plan: expanding our productive capacity, bolstering our economic resilience, and creating an economy that works for all. Earlier this year, I delivered a speech calling for a modern supply side expansion of our economy. With the labor market at full employment, I argued that the current moment is well suited for a supply side agenda that increases our economy's productive capacity. A country's long term growth potential depends on, among other things, how many people we have working and the productivity of our workers. Concerted investments in both areas increase the ceiling for what our economy can produce. Less than a year later, I'm proud to report that we have enacted key parts of this modern supply side agenda. There are three major laws powering our growth strategy. The bipartisan infrastructure law is modernizing our nation's physical and digital infrastructure, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. The CHIPS Act is growing semiconductor manufacturing here at home, and the Inflation Reduction Act is our nation's largest ever investment in clean energy, and it will bolster America's leadership in the industries of the future for years to come. Economic research has long established that investment in basic infrastructure increases productivity, attracts business activity, and is associated with higher rates of economic growth. Put simply, good infrastructure makes it easier to make things in America and ship our products to the world. Better freight rail allows goods to move from point A to point B with fewer disruptions. Modern roads, bridges, and public transportation help connect workers with training, education, and better jobs. Expanding our electric grid and broadband infrastructure help lay the foundations for modern industries like clean energy and digital technology. Our economic plan invests in everything I just mentioned, but we also know it's not enough just to fund infrastructure. We need to accelerate the pace at which we deploy these projects in order to maximize the economic benefits. This month, our administration announced an action plan to efficiently deliver infrastructure that is on time, on task, and on budget. We're advancing our permitting action plan to speed up investments while upholding bedrock standards and laws. We're also working with employers, labor unions, and training providers to build a robust talent pipeline of skilled workers in sectors like construction and electrification. In sum, our investments in infrastructure will boost our economic potential. They will help build on the progress we've made in American manufacturing. They will also help our economy cope with unexpected shocks like pandemics or climate disasters. And that brings me to the next pillar of our economic plan, which is strengthening our economic resilience. Over the past few years, we have witnessed immense disruptions in our lives. The confluence of the pandemic's economic effects, climate disasters, and Putin's illegal war in Ukraine have driven food and energy price volatility and created shortages in some of our most critical goods. Our administration is building resilience to such future shocks by strengthening our supply chains and growing critical manufacturing industries in America. Semiconductors have been a major area of focus. These microchips power so much of modern life, from phones to cars to washing machines. They also power technologies that are crucial to our national defense. The United States is a leader in certain parts of the semiconductor ecosystem, like chip design, but we've lost our leadership in semiconductor manufacturing. 3 decades ago, the United States made 37% of semiconductors sold globally. But today we only produce 12%. And when it comes to the most advanced chips, we have no meaningful manufacturing capacity at all. Semiconductors are so critical that China, Japan, South Korea, and the European Union have or are about to invest in growing their domestic manufacturing capacity. And the economic stakes here are high. The pandemic chip shortage resulted in a loss of about $240 billion in US GDP last year. Here in Ohio, the shortage caused automakers like Ford to temporarily shut down their assembly plants. Our economic plan is nurturing the growth of the full semiconductor ecosystem in the United States, from R&D to design to fabrication. Tens of billions of dollars will go toward growing domestic semiconductor manufacturing in America. And we believe that this will reduce economic and national security risks. It will provide greater certainty to both businesses and consumers, and will also build our leadership in areas like R&D. Close collaboration between lab and fab is necessary directing R&D efforts based on what works on the factory floor. And there's already been progress. Major manufacturers are expanding their US footprint. Just last month, Intel broke ground on its $20 billion semiconductor plant outside of Columbus. Intel's project is said to be the single largest private investment in Ohio's history. When completed, it will employ thousands of Ohioans and support tens of thousands of additional long-term jobs throughout the ecosystem. We're already seeing reverberating effects of this investment on local communities. For example, Intel is investing $50 million in Ohio colleges and universities to help train the next generation of chip makers. Our semiconductor investments demonstrate that government and business can work together to nurture and grow new industries. It also demonstrates that we can work together to broaden economic opportunity and create good paying jobs. In fact, a deliberate feature of our modern supply side agenda is the allocation of investments across people and places, particularly those that are historically underserved. For too long, regions like the Midwest have suffered through decades of underinvestment. Wages for too many working families have stagnated. At the same time, providing for basic needs and investing in their kids' futures have become increasingly expensive. The costs of childcare, health care, buying a home, and a higher education have risen faster than median household income over the past 3 decades. The traditional approach to supply side economics focuses on generating economic growth through deregulation and tax cuts that disproportionately benefit the wealthiest Americans and large corporations. But economic evidence indicates that this strategy has failed to achieve its promised gains. And in many cases, it has also exacerbated income and wealth inequality. In contrast, our modern supply side agenda recognizes that investing in underserved communities is not just good for the community itself, it's actually good for the whole economy. Given the economic premise of diminishing returns, we believe that investments in underserved communities have higher relative returns on investment, and they also help unlock the potential of all Americans, and that expands our economic capacity. A prime example is investing in small manufacturers, including those in underserved communities. Treasury recently approved Ohio to receive up to $182 million in small business funding through the state Small Business Credit Initiative. This American Rescue Plan program is expected to mobilize up to 10 times the amount of public funding through private capital to support small businesses across the country, including small manufacturers. During the prior version of this program, Ohio generated over $28 million in support to small manufacturers. We're beginning to see signs of renewal in places and sectors that have traditionally seen disinvestment. American manufacturing employment had dropped precipitously over the past few decades. In Ohio, people employed in manufacturing jobs fell from 1 million in 2000 to less than 700,000 20 years later, even as Ohio's population grew. But our administration's manufacturing incentives have recently led to a wave of private sector commitments that will power our economy and create good paying jobs. Clean energy industries have been shown to create broad opportunity across the country, including in non coastal areas and communities traditionally reliant on fossil fuel extraction. In fact, the Inflation Reduction Act provides businesses with bonus tax incentives for investing in low income and energy communities. This is a place-based investment strategy that's designed to broaden economic opportunity across all communities. Since January of last year, companies have announced over $100 billion in EV, battery, and charging investments here in America. Honda and LG earlier this month announced a battery plant in Fayette County right outside Columbus. This plant will create thousands of new jobs, and the wave of new battery investments in the Midwest has been so significant that some commentators are dubbing the region as the new battery belt. We expect to see our economic plan continue to drive a significant amount of capital into good, clean energy and manufacturing jobs over the coming months and years. As we create an economy that works for all Americans, we also know economic fairness requires all Americans to play by the same rules. But too often, that has not been the case in our tax system. We currently have a two-tiered tax system, one where average families pay their fair share, while large corporations and high-income earners too often do not. Take the tax gap. That's the amount of taxes owed but not paid to the IRS. In 2019, the top 1% of Americans was estimated to owe over a fifth of unpaid taxes, a total of around $160 billion. And much of this disparity stemmed from chronic underinvestment in the IRS. And this is something that was simply unacceptable to the president and to me. So we secured $80 billion of new funding for the agency. And this funding will enable the IRS to increase audits of taxpayers at the high end who have not paid their full bill. As I've said before, I've directed that enforcement resources will not be used to raise audit rates for households making under $400,000 a year relative to historical levels. In fact, once the IRS has the right technological infrastructure in place, we expect audit rates for honest taxpayers to decline. By closing the tax gap, we will raise hundreds of billions of dollars in additional revenue over this decade. Our corporate tax reforms, like the 15% minimum tax on the largest corporations, will raise hundreds of billions more as well. And the additional revenue will strengthen our public finances. It can be used to fund additional investments in our economic strength, lower the deficit, or reduce taxes for working families. And I believe that these tax reforms reflect the values underpinning our entire economic plan, namely that economic fairness actually adds to rather than subtracts from our overall economic strength. So when we look back decades from now, I believe that we will view the past 2 years as a uniquely difficult time for our country and the world. We've gone through so much together: a pandemic, a war in Europe, and an acceleration of climate disasters. There's much more we have to do to ease the strain on working families. But I believe that we will also view this period as a time when we renewed America's economic strength. We're positioning America to build, innovate, and lead in the 21st century. I look forward to building that future together with you, and I want to end by congratulating you again on the opening of your new center. Thank you.